Please note that this webinar is being recorded and will be available for later viewing. All participants registered for the webinar will receive an email to update you when the recording is available for viewing. In addition, you should have also received an email from the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges with the handout version of the slides for this webinar. At the completion of the webinar, a link will be posted into the chat for the post-webinar evaluation, and you will also get an email with that post-webinar evaluation information. Please complete the evaluation and provide us feedback from today's event so that we're able to plan future webinars and future educational opportunities. We'd like to take a moment to acknowledge and thank Office of Violence Against Women, as this webinar has been developed today in part by funding from 2 separate OVW grant funded projects. The presenters for this presentation disclose no conflicts of interest, and as a benefit of membership for IAFN, members of IAFN are eligible to receive 1.5 contact hours for continuing nursing education activity. The IAFN is an approved provider of continued nursing education by the American Nurses Credentialing Center Commission to Accreditation. For IAFN members to obtain CE for this activity, they're asked to attend the session in full and complete the post-webinar evaluation that I spoke about. Members who attend and complete the evaluation will receive a certificate of continuing nursing education credit upon completion of the evaluation. Everyone else will receive a completion of a certificate of completion. I apologize. So now we're going to go into the presenters. So again, as I said, my name is Angelita Oluwu. I am a forensic nursing specialist with the International Association of Forensic Nurses. I provide technical assistance as well as training for the organization, and I also work on several of our grant funded projects. I would like to hand it over to Cynthia to introduce herself.
Hi everyone, I'm Cynthia Totten from Just Detention International. I'm a Deputy Executive Director in our Washington, D.C. office. In my work at JDI, I lead our national training and technical assistance program, supporting the work of state and tribal sexual assault and dual coalitions, as well as victim advocacy programs, corrections officials, and funding administrators from around the country. All with the goal of ensuring that incarcerated survivors have access to crisis services. I also work with corrections agencies on adopting policies that keep prisoners safe from sexual abuse and that are compliant with the Prison Rape Elimination Act. I'm glad to be here. Thanks, Angelita.
Thank you, Cynthia. How about Marianne? Would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, thank you, Angelita. Good afternoon. My name is Marianne Morgan. I'm an Associate Director with the PREA Resource Center. I'm also a certified PREA auditor. I came to the PREA Resource Center in 2014 after 3 years as the PREA Coordinator Director with the Wisconsin Department of Corrections. Prior to that, I was a law enforcement officer, the majority of my time as a detective, investigating sensitive crimes, including sex crimes, strangulation, homicide. I also spent time in the narcotics unit, investigating complex narcotics investigations. And my passion has always been sexual safety. So I'm really glad to be here and look forward to this presentation as well. Monica?
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Monica Dijon Domenico. I am a Senior Program Specialist with the National PREA Resource Center. I work primarily with the Field Training Program, who trains Department of Justice PREA auditors, and I also contribute to the Training and Technical Assistance Division at the PRC. I have a combined 10 years of criminal and civil investigative experience, and I obtained my master's in forensic science with a concentration in crime scene investigations from George Washington University in 2012. I'm also an adult and juvenile certified Department of Justice PREA auditor, and I'm excited to be here with you today.
Thank you, Marianne. Thank you, Monica. I'm always excited to do presentations with all of you. And thank you, Cynthia, as well. I forgot you're not showing your face on the slide, so thank you guys for being here. Let's go ahead and take a look at the learning objectives. I'm not going to go through all of them, but I do want to acknowledge that these are the learning objectives that will be covered in today's webinar. We would also like to note that throughout the webinar that relevant PREA standards will be referenced. Please keep in mind that the PREA standards are considered to be the floor or at least the minimum requirements. But the expectation is to at least meet those minimum requirements or those minimum standards. And the goal should be for you to exceed those standards. So one of the goals of this presentation is to present you information that will increase your understanding of the response process for sexual abuse for incarcerated survivors and the function of using best practice in that response. At the completion of each of these case studies, we will provide an opportunity for you all to insert questions that you may have regarding that specific case study into the QA box, so the question and answer box that was presented to you in the beginning of this webinar when we opened up. That Q&A box is located in your Zoom controls. We ask that you place all of your questions that are specific to case studies directly into that box. We're doing this because after this webinar, the IFN, Just Detention International, and the PREA Resource Center will come together. We'll compile all of the questions that you guys put in there. We will review them and create answers for them, and we will send them all to you in a questions and answers handout that we will put together after this webinar has been completed. So just keep that in mind. I will remind you throughout the webinar as we go through the case studies about the box and remind you to put questions that you may have actually in there. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to Cynthia and Monica, and they're going to talk about terminology with you.
Great. Thanks, Angelita. So before we kind of just get started going over terminology, I wanted to just give a general note, which is that it's really about person-first language. So throughout the webinar, you'll hear us use terms like inmate, for example, but you'll also hear us using terms like incarcerated survivor. And similarly, when we're talking about incarcerated survivors who are transgender, you'll hear us use the term transgender person or transgender survivor as opposed to the transgender. And this is all because language matters, and we are intentionally using language that is in keeping with the mission of our three organizations, and that the language that we will use emphasizes the dignity and humanity of every person and recognizes that a person can be incarcerated and a crime victim at the same time, right? Those aren't mutually exclusive identities. And that every survivor of sexual assault, no matter where they are and regardless of their involvement in the criminal legal system, deserves access to healing and to trauma-informed services. Monica, do you want to go over the terms a little bit?
That would be great. Thank you, Cynthia. So we wanted to provide everybody with some additional context regarding today's webinar content. So the following slides are going to provide you with some terminology and definitions that will help all of us understand the case scenarios presented today. Next slide. So we're not going to read all of these, but we encourage you to refer back to them for any additional guidance that you may need as we go through the case studies today. In this slide, we provide additional information regarding the scenario terminology specifically that we'll be using in the case studies. We have multiple professionals from various disciplines attending the webinar today that might not be as familiar as others with some of these terms, and we wanted to make sure that we provided the context necessary to allow for a full understanding of the scenarios described in today's webinar. So we're going to start with the definition of sexual abuse in the PREA standards, which is under standard 115.6. And it's important for us to know the PREA definitions of sexual abuse to be able to understand our individual first responder roles and responsibilities when it comes to sexual abuse incidents in confinement. So this definition is taken directly from the PREA standards, and the definitions apply to an inmate on inmate, of course, sexual abuse incident, or a staff member, volunteer, or contractor on inmate sexual abuse incident. And the next slides, we're going to provide some additional details pertaining to these definitions of sexual abuse. So this slide and the next is just providing you additional details around the verbiage of the PREA standards definitions of sexual abuse. And we're not going to read these again, but we encourage you to refer back to them if you have any questions as it relates to the case scenarios that we go over today. So please note, we did not provide the definitions for sexual harassment nor voyeurism, because today we're just going to be focusing primarily on sexual abuse. But if you're interested in also understanding those definitions, they are also provided in the standards 115.6. And before we get really started, we wanted to emphasize the importance of establishing partnerships with community-based service providers and it being the optimal way to meet the PREA standard requirements and ensure that incarcerated survivors' needs are met. The following slides provide information about the standards that directly relate to the level of victim services that correctional agencies are responsible for providing and coordinating. Depending on the structure and location of the correctional agency or facility, partners are essential to providing these services. And these partners, of course, can be from state, county, or local organizations. We encourage correctional agencies and facilities, as well as community-based organizations, to seek new partners to work with or consider how to strengthen or expand those existing relationships with their community-based service providers.
Great. And just to say a little bit about, again, the importance of these relationships. So the following slides are going to provide a brief outline of the importance and benefits of formulating the types of partnerships that Monica is referring to for the promotion of access to victim services. So some of the main things to keep in mind, and they're not always easy, and we'll talk about that a little bit today, is learning about each other's operations, gaining understanding of each other's language and culture, and addressing the roles and responsibilities of each of the partners openly. So as we proceed through the webinar today, one theme that I think you'll notice is that a lot of the success on the ground in the moment, right, in that forensic exam is going to be due to the pre-work and the preparation that's done ahead of time, where the partners come together and they talk about what are the expectations, how do we define different terms, how do we come to this work, where do our goals for this work around sexual safety overlap. So we'll talk about some ways to make that concrete, but keep that sort of overarching theme in mind as we proceed. Thanks.
And so with every relationship comes hurdles. So be open to anticipating and planning for those potential hurdles. It's important to be present and active in your sexual assault response team or your multidisciplinary team, whatever may be available in your community. And if you don't have one available in your community, it's really important to work together to create one. You want to use that platform to discuss challenges and gaps in the existing response for the incarcerated survivor. These conversations should not only be about problem solving, but they should also be about taking the time to learn more about each other's organizations that are involved in the team. As you just heard on the last slide, take the time to learn about the roles and the responsibilities that are a part of the agencies that are in a part of this response. Think about what are the strengths and the capacities for each organization. You heard Cynthia mention about goals. Take a look at those goals and look at them for each organization and then compare. Are there organizations that are sitting at the same table that reflect, or are there some that need to build off of each other? It's really important to consider that. The other thing you want to think about is resources. So what resources are already available, relevant specifically to incarcerated survivors? Are there any resources that you may be lacking? Is there something that you guys can come together collaboratively to develop and to provide and have available for, whether it be for your community or whether even for your state? Just think about, if you're limited, there may be other areas in your state that also may be limited that you may be able to create something to share. All of this allows for interaction and conversation to establish a foundation for planning for next steps and for ongoing evaluation of your process. So I'm going to take a second here and we'll do a quick poll question. How many of you here on this webinar today believe that your facilities have established partnerships like these already? I'll give a few minutes so that people have an opportunity to put their answers into the poll. And so at this point, there's about 60% of you that are saying yes. There's about 28% that feel like maybe. And then there are 11% that say no. They know that there's not one existing at this point. So just thinking about that, that's, thinking about the answer, especially the ones that are maybe or unsure. This is something that you definitely can go back and think about. How can we better this? How can we build those relationships? How can we have those partnerships? Do we have a SART or a multidisciplinary team that maybe we want to go back and create or work with a little bit better? Or if you do have them and you're not a part of them, how do you get to that table? And for other disciplines, how do we make sure that everybody is at the table that needs to be there for the appropriate response? Monica, Marian, Cynthia, do any of you have anything you wanted to add to this poll question before we moved on?
No, it's just I noticed, this is Cynthia, that somebody put in the chat that they could do better. So I think that's the other question that I would have for folks to keep in mind as we go through the webinar, is that for those of you who said, yes, we do have partnerships that look like this, think about ways that you can improve and make your partnership stronger for the long haul.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Angelita, this is Marian. I would also encourage you to think broadly about who should be at that table, right? Most community-based sexual assault response teams will have law enforcement, they will have medical forensic, they will have advocacy. We're asking you to think about then adding corrections professionals, right, to that SART. You may want to look at other forensic specialists, for example, a forensic odontologist, somebody who does dental. Oftentimes in sexual abuse in custody and out, biting is something involved. You may want to look at other forensic experts to be at least identified and aware of your existing SART so that you create as robust a team to respond to sexual abuse, sexual in confinement as possible. Thank you.
Thank you. Those are great points. Thank you both. So now we're just going to take a few minutes just to make sure that we're all on the same page about the purpose of the medical forensic exam. It's really important for us to all be on the same page about that. So even though we're talking about survivors in the incarcerated setting, we do have to keep in mind that they're still a survivor. They still deserve the same exact medical forensic exam. They still have it. The exam itself has the same purpose as any other person in the general population that would be presenting for a medical forensic exam. So the purpose is going to be medical care and treatment of that patient. So at this point, I'm a nurse, if you recall, I'm the forensic nursing specialist. For me, that's a patient. So my goal is going to be able to provide them medical care and treatment as my patient. I'm going to be evaluating and treating any injuries that I identify. I'm going to be addressing any complaints that they present with me. So even if I don't see it with my own eyes, but they're telling me that they're having pain or they're telling me that something occurred and at the time they had pain or bleeding, I'm going to be addressing that injury. There's always the potential for collection of forensic evidence. I'm going to be evaluating and treating for STDs. I'm going to be looking for pregnancy and other health sequelae for each patient. I'm going to be developing post-assault plans for safety. So that means I'm going to be working with that team that we just talked about. I'm going to be working with that team to make sure that patient is safe while we're in that exam, that they're safe in their transition back, and how can we work together to try and ensure that they're safe beyond when they're with me, when they go back to their correctional facility and they have to go back to that incarcerated setting. How can we work together to make sure that that is actually being achieved? Monica, did you have anything you wanted to add here?
Yes, thanks, Angelita. So one of the things I'd like to emphasize is that many of the PREA standards are interconnected. So it's worth mentioning that we made a notation at the bottom of this slide that provides a list of the PREA standards that directly correlate with the sexual abuse incident for incarcerated survivors response and the purpose and the need for the forensic medical exam.
Great. So I was just going to comment on the question of the qualified victim advocate. So when you look at standard 115.21, it refers to the victim advocate in their role as providing support in connection with the medical forensic exam, but it also refers alternatively to a qualified agency staff member and a qualified community-based organization staff member, meaning that in instances where a rape crisis advocate from a local rape crisis program essentially is not available to provide support, the agency can still turn to either a qualified agency staff member from their own corrections agency or a qualified community-based staff member. But in either case, this person needs to be an individual who has been screened for appropriateness to serve in this role and who has received education concerning sexual assault and forensic examination issues in general. And I would just add to that this is the type of role that you don't want to sort of voluntold, have someone be voluntold that, again, this is something you're going to take on. It really should be someone who's interested in providing and feels comfortable functioning in this type of role because of the obvious kind of conflict, in a sense, that a person might feel around operating in this capacity. Monica and Marian?
Great. So now we're going to get into the meat of our presentation. So we're going to get started with our first case study scenario, which is going to be an inmate on inmate sexual abuse incident. So it was a weekend evening at John Doe County Jail. Central booking was extremely busy with the bullpen nearly at full capacity. Frank had been brought in on larceny charges, and it was his first time being in jail. Frank was placed in the bullpen with many other people. Frank was avoiding eye contact with everyone. He found a spot to sit in the corner of the bullpen behind the toilet wall. Another detainee was staring at him and approached him slowly. Frank avoided eye contact and tried to ignore the man. The other man moved closer to Frank, causing Frank to stand up. The next thing Frank knew, he was pinned up against the wall. The man put his hand over Frank's mouth. With the other hand, the man grabbed Frank's penis and scrotum over Frank's pants. Frank looked frantically around for help, but could not say anything since his mouth was covered. Some of the inmates were sleeping, others were talking. Suddenly, the man let go of Frank and walked to the other side of the bullpen. Frank slumped down to the floor. 2 days later, Frank was in his assigned housing unit and he wrote a kite to the officer assigned to his unit that stated, "Someone touched me." So to make the scenario easier to follow, and so you're able to easily identify the role and responsibilities of the many parties involved in a coordinated response, we've went ahead and outlined them by the role on each of the slides. So please note they're not in chronological order. So once an allegation is made, there are a number of things, as we all know, that can be going on all at once. And ongoing communication is extremely important to be able to clearly identify and document the response. So let's walk through the first responder duties, which in this case is the unit officer in the scenario. The officer receives and reads the kite, which is a note, and it states, "Somebody touched me." The officer knows he needs to speak to Frank and find out what happened. So the officer then takes Frank out of the housing unit and into the hallway and asks Frank what happened. Frank explains to the officer what happened in booking 2 days before and provides a description of the abuser, who is a fellow inmate, and says it happened when he was in the bullpen prior to him being booked into the jail. The officer gets enough information from Frank to decide how to move forward with responding. It's worth mentioning that the first responding officer's job is not to investigate, but get enough information about the incident to ensure the survivor's safety and preserve any evidence from being destroyed. So the officer then takes Frank to a private interview room near the housing unit. The officer asks Frank, has he changed his clothes since the incident? And Frank explains the assault had happened while he was still in his street clothes. I'd like to make a note here that Frank's clothes at the time of the abuse are in the property room. And it is not the responsibility of this first responding officer to secure that evidence. Rather, it's the detective who will obtain and secure the clothing of Frank that he was wearing when he came into booking 2 days prior. The officer then asked Frank if he drank, ate, brushed his teeth, or washed his body. Frank explains that he has eaten, that he has drank something, he brushed his teeth, and has washed his face, but has not showered. The officer then notifies the watch commander, which is the supervisor on duty, of the sexual abuse allegation that he received.
Okay, so we have the foundation, we have the information about the allegation, and we now have the correction staff involved. So after the watch commander is notified, or the supervisor of the sexual abuse allegation, the watch commander notifies the detective unit, and that could be within the sheriff's department, or it could be local law enforcement, but that would be something that would be clearly identified as part of the coordinated response to any allegations of sexual abuse in a confinement setting. The supervisor follows the facility response protocol, which again is something that should be predetermined and even codified in a policy or a guide. The supervisor then obtains any camera footage from booking or the bullpen area to try and identify who the abuser is, right? Because perhaps that's not captured, the assault isn't captured on video, but they may be some of the activity, meaning a person walking towards the toilet area and then walking away. The watch commander is able to identify the abuser because the video footage shows the activity before and after the incident or the assault. What the watch commander sees on the video footage is the abuser walking towards and away, as I said, to the toilet area of the bullpen, but didn't capture the assault, which is quite common. So many sexual assault cases are made by what happened before the assault and what happened after the assault. Remember, as Monica said, that things don't happen necessarily in a chronological order, and there are other things going on once the allegation is reported by the survivor. The detective bureau is notified, and a detective is assigned and responds to the jail facility to identify the abuser or the abused party, Frank, and then also to get Frank's assistance in confirming the identity of the perpetrator. The detective advises the watch commander to immediately remove the abuser from the housing unit and put that abuser in an administrative separation or segregation cell under observation and supervision. This is to ensure that he is monitored from an evidentiary standpoint and from a safety standpoint as well. And the watch commander also confirms that the abuser and Frank are not housed in the same area or in an area where there could be visual, verbal communication to ensure that there is no other intimidation or acts of violence that can occur. The watch commander is asked to do this for the following reasons. As I said, ensure that evidence isn't destroyed or lost and no additional harm comes to Frank or anyone else in the housing unit. The watch commander facilitates transportation for Frank to and from the hospital for a medical forensic exam and notifies the Rape Crisis Center advocate for accompaniment. The advocate's response may also be part of the medical forensic exam, meaning it's maybe part of the protocol for the sexual assault nurse examiner and medical examiner program. That continues to follow the facility response protocol and includes notifying the PREA coordinator, the PREA compliance manager who's housed in the facility or operates in the facility, and the jail administrator. Next slide, please. The investigative unit responsibilities in the case when the detective becomes involved. Now, this is an ongoing criminal investigation at this point because there is information to indicate that there was sexual contact. So there will be engagement and consultation between the facility watch commander, the investigative unit, and who will be taking the lead in the investigation based on the facts and details that are reported. Clearly, because this is a criminal allegation and investigation, the detective or the investigative team is going to take the lead. At the same time, there must be consideration and discussion that occurs as to when an internal or administrative investigation is going to occur. And really, oftentimes that criminal investigation takes the lead, and the internal or administrative investigation that's going to be looking at rules violations on the part of the abuser, and that administrative investigation will lag behind at the request of criminal, because it's important that the criminal investigation is undertaken in a way that's not going to compromise evidence or any related aspects of the criminal case. So the administrative investigation will occur, but the timing as to when that occurs is determined by collaborative communication between the criminal investigator and the facility and its internal investigative team. Once there's discussion about when that administrative criminal investigation and the sequencing of that, then Frank is going to be interviewed by the detective who is assigned, and best practice, best case scenario is that the detective has specialized training in sexual abuse investigations. So that detective is going to interview Frank to get information about the mechanics of the sexual abuse. And what I mean by that is what kind of contact occurred, what body part of the abuser had contact with what body part of Frank, the survivor. Frank, in this case, is going to tell the detective that, as stated earlier by Monica, that the abuser covered Frank's mouth with the abuser's hand. That's important because that's going to be a source of DNA evidence for us on both the abuser and Frank, the survivor. Frank's going to talk about the pain that he is in. That's going to be important as it goes to the elements of sexual abuse that happened. Frank's going to tell the investigator where the abuser contacted Frank on his body, and he talks about the fact that the abuser contacted him or grabbed Frank's crotch and groin over his pants, and that as a result of that, Frank was experiencing soreness and tenderness. This is important because, again, this goes to the element of the crime and also provides information on where we're going to find forensic evidence. Frank also says that he didn't encourage this, didn't ask for this, and regardless of the fact that this happened in a confinement setting, the criminal investigation is still going to go forward as comprehensively as it would in the community. The detective confirms that the watch commander separated the abuser from the area where Frank was in the housing unit, and that the abuser is in a position, in a place where he can be again supervised and in a situation where he can't abuse or intimidate anyone else. Frank then is escorted to the medical facility within the medical unit within the facility for the medical team in the facility to conduct a triage or assessment to assure that there are no immediate medical or physical safety concerns or issues that need to be addressed, such as injury. And the medical team is, because they've received appropriate sexual abuse training in a confinement setting, aware of the evidentiary implications, and so that they're looking for immediate medical trauma and issues. And if that's not identified, in conjunction with the investigator, they are going to make a determination, a referral for a medical forensic exam to be conducted at the medical facility identified. And in most cases, medical forensic exams are conducted outside of the facility by medical forensic specialists and not by facility or agency medical staff for a number of reasons. And so Frank is then escorted from the facility by a transport team to the medical forensic facility. Let's go to the next slide. Let's see, to follow-up investigation. The detective is going to conduct a more in-depth interview with Frank at the hospital, where they're safe and removed from the environment at the medical facility. And it's important for the investigator to be clear about, based on information from Frank, how they're going to sequence subsequent interviews with other potential witnesses. So what happens when the escort team takes Frank from the facility to the hospital for the medical forensic exam is going to be a discussion between the case detective and the medical forensic examiner, where the medical forensic examiner is briefed by the investigator, who has been advised by Frank based on Frank's ability to recall and report at that time, right? And thinking about trauma impact on an inmate or any survivor's ability to recall information in sequence based on where they are in their trauma response. So the investigator talks about the physical trauma and the information that Frank has provided. The investigator and the medical forensic person conduct that briefing oftentimes without the victim and survivor present, because again, going over that information is another situation where recalling that and recounting that can be an additional trauma to that survivor. So they want to have that conversation in a discrete place, in a discrete way. Regardless of what the victim reports to investigators, the safe sane expert is going to follow their protocol and conduct a comprehensive head-to-toe assessment and evaluation of the victim survivor to ensure that there is no medical issue or trauma, which will include an internal and external exam based on the facts and what the evidence shows with the medical forensic exam. And they're going to not just rely on the information that's been relayed to them by the detective or even the victim survivor, because often this kind of trauma doesn't always lend itself to that victim survivor being able to, one, relay what happened in a sequential order, or two, even have words to describe what happened to them. So that's why the medical forensic protocol is conducted in the same way every time, noting from head to toe the condition of the victim survivor's body and looking for other sources of evidence, which can include injury or trauma that didn't occur as a result of the sexual assault, but just noting everything, because through the investigation, it could turn out that that abuser may have information about the victim's survivor's body that could be of evidentiary value. I know I'm speaking quickly here. I just want to hit so that you get an understanding of what's going in the criminal investigation, the collaboration from criminal and medical forensics, that not only trauma as a result of the assault could be of evidentiary value, but anything else that is seen by the medical forensic examiner to help share information with law enforcement to enhance the evidence collection for the criminal case. Please note that an advocate is there to provide support during the medical forensic exam and should be also present as the investigation continues, right? Interviews that can occur in the facility subsequent to the medical forensic exam and during the course of the investigation. One of the other concerns that we will want to be mindful of is that if an investigation is complete and comprehensive, not only will evidence be collected from the victim survivor, but a medical forensic exam should be conducted on the abuser and perpetrator. They're the other half of this evidence collection process. So cross-contamination considerations should be identified well in advance through the combined response team. And there should be protocols and policies that address this issue and other considerations, because if that hasn't been identified in advance of actually responding to cases, criminal cases and even administrative cases can be compromised by issues of cross-contamination. So I'm going to touch on that to that extent and move on because we have time considerations. And I'm going to turn it back to Monica. Monica?
Great, thanks. So now we're going to move on to facility medical staff responsibility. So recap slightly, the detective has escorted Frank to the jail medical unit for a medical assessment. So the detective is going to communicate with the facility medical staff as to why they brought Frank to the medical unit. And this is important because the facility medical staff does not perform a medical forensic exam. Rather, the medical forensic exams are being provided by an outside provider, a SANE, at a regional hospital. And that facility medical staff, they don't want to inadvertently, of course, destroy any evidence. So the facility medical staff asks Frank about his medical conditions. Frank tells them he has pain on the inside of both cheeks and his groin is tender. And the facility medical staff conducts that initial medical assessment of his injuries. The facility medical staff then addresses his medical concerns and, in collaboration with the detective, informs Frank of his rights by explaining what a medical forensic exam is. And Frank then confirms that he would like a medical forensic exam. The facility medical the facility medical staff contacts the SANE point of contact at that regional hospital for the medical forensic exam. They provide them with a summary of the injuries and circumstances around what happened. So it's kind of like a heads up. Again, ongoing communication is so key. Facility medical staff will then provide a sealed envelope with Frank's medical information to be provided to the SANE, which will be returned and sealed from the SANE back to the facility medical staff, which will outline Frank's medical care that's provided and treatment plan for follow-up medical services. And the medical staff at the facility will provide this treatment. Now, if the medical staff was unable to provide the continuing and follow-up treatment, then what would happen is the facility would organize the treatment to be provided at the hospital or an outpatient medical treatment facility. So we're going to move on. And let's talk about the transportation of the survivor and how this is a critical component of the response. So in this, the transportation for a medical forensic exam is orchestrated by the watch commander. They put the transport officers on standby because they might be needed not only for the survivor, but also for the abuser. So the transport officers would follow security operation procedures for sexual abuse of an inmate at the facility. And the two transport officers for each van to ensure there is no contact between the survivor and the abuser, as well as that there is no cross-contamination possibilities. So transportation also obtains an extra clean jumpsuit for Frank to be able to change into after the medical forensic exam. Now, in this scenario, only the survivor, Frank, is being transported to the off-site with a SANE to conduct the medical forensic exam. And the transport officers obtain that sealed medical envelope that we talked prior to be able to provide that once they reach the hospital. When the transport van arrives at the hospital, they go through the staff medical bay using a private staff elevator to the SANE room, the exam room. So rather than going through the emergency room or main entrance, the method of their secure entry was developed in advance, talking with the hospital security and the SANE program, as well as the facility's concerns for safety and security. And again, that ongoing communication. One of the transport officers then provide, of course, the sealed envelope to the SANE, and now they're in the treatment room. Now, the transportation officer should be familiar with the security protocols at the hospital for incarcerated survivor. This means that the protocol might differ from a medical emergency from a physical assault. Once the medical forensic exam is completed, Frank changes into the new jumpsuit and he's transported back from the hospital to the facility. And the transportation officer collects a sealed medical envelope from the SANE and provides it to the facility medical staff upon return. And I'm going to hand it back over to Marian.
Thanks, Monica. So I'm going to just, again, some of these aspects have already been addressed, but I want to start with the importance of ensuring under standard 115.21 that the accompaniment by advocacy is clearly understood. And this is what Cynthia referred to, correct? I mean, it's often part of the medical forensic protocol that advocacy is notified by the SANE staff, and they can also be notified by the correction staff. Redundancy is a very good thing here. We don't want the advocacy support to fall through the loop, the hoop in any way. And again, there isn't a community-based sexual assault service provider or advocate available. As Cynthia mentioned before, there are ways to ensure that staff from the agency or facility are qualified and trained to function in that capacity. As Monica said, Frank is transported by that transport team from the facility to the hospital. The rape crisis advocate is there. And some of this is being repeated just because this is such a critical piece. Oftentimes we look to advocacy and emotional support sort of as the, if we can sort of situation, but it really is a critical component of providing quality service to an incarcerated survivor or any survivor for that purpose. The victim advocate is there at the hospital, and says, yeah, I received a call from the sexual assault nurse examiner safe staff, and I received a call from the facility. So that kind of redundancy is a good thing to have. And then the advocate is going to provide, after the medical forensic exam is done, advocacy referral information for ongoing support to Frank. And I want to say something to the advocates out there. This requires specialized training, as Cynthia mentioned, because many of the coping and support and self-care methods and techniques that you provide to people who are not incarcerated, take a nice hot bath for calming, light some incense, take a walk, those are not the same coping and supportive suggestions that you can provide to somebody who is incarcerated. So it's really important that you've been trained to prepare and understand what happens inside a confinement facility, so that the resources and support that you provide for somebody who's a survivor in a confinement setting are things that are available to them and that they can do. So I want to go on to the next slide, please. Which is slide 27, I think we're on. And again, we are 28. We're going to set the stage for Frank at the hospital and is brought in for the medical forensic. Am I on the wrong slide?
Nope, you're right, Marion.
Okay, 28.
Yep.
Okay, so the sexual assault nurse examiner goes into the exam room and explains in detail what the process is. This is so critical because, as it is, this survivor is so traumatized. I mean, just referring back to this in my experience working investigations, it is so critical that information is provided to a survivor, and especially an incarcerated survivor who really, this is just so not what is expected when you're in an incarcerative setting. So explaining to Frank what is going to happen during the exam, explaining to Frank that he can consent or not consent to any part of the exam, which is very important. The sane provider is going to document the history, document observations. They're going to be using an anatomical chart along with using the documents and package of information that they have to conduct their sane exam. They're going to conduct that head to toe, as I mentioned before, and they're going to be looking for anything and everything that should be documented in writing and or on the anatomical chart. So Frank talks about pain in his mouth. That's going to be documented, and a close observation of that is going to be conducted by the same safe person. They're going to take swabs from the outside of his mouth. They're going to take swabs from the inside of his mouth. They're going to check his groin area for tenderness. And throughout all of this evidence collection, they're going to continue to ask Frank and reassure that they have permission and consent, explain why it's helpful to have this information. Any scratches, bites, marks, tattoos, any of that is also going to be documented on the anatomical chart, because when the interview is conducted of the perpetrator or abuser, he may make reference to some of those things, which would give an indication from an evidentiary standpoint and from a criminal investigative standpoint that, he has this information, and this could be substantive in terms of proving the case and the method and manner in which the assault occurred. Once the sexual assault kit is completed and the sexual assault nurse examiner, forensic nurse has collected and dried swabs and packaged everything as it should be, then the kit is turned over to the detective for disposition and relayed to the property room, or depending on the time and the urgency, it could even be conveyed directly to the crime lab for analysis. So this part of it, it's going on, and you're going to hear this from the medical forensic staff, from Angelita, but at the same time, this is also a component that law enforcement is involved in. So here again is the collaboration, right? The communication, the working together. Monica, I'm going to turn it over to you now. Thank you.
Great. So again, we're repeating the ongoing communication is so key, but it's essential. So in this case, the mental health staff was notified by the PREA coordinator of services needed for Frank. So remember, way back when, the PREA coordinator was contacted by that watch commander for notifications. So upon return to the facility, Frank receives a follow-up with the mental health staff, An assessment is conducted to help address Frank's trauma. Frank is still housed in the facility and can use outside confidential emotional support services via the phone. Now, it's worth mentioning that the outcome of this investigation does not affect Frank's access to these services. I want to emphasize that the PREA standards require also that treatment services shall be provided to the victims without financial cost and regardless of whether the victim names the abuser or cooperates with an investigation arising out of an incident. Let's move on. When Frank is released from the facility months after the sexual abuse incident, after the investigation is completed, he is provided referrals in the community for mental health services. Now, we don't have enough time to go over all of this in detail about the ongoing services and considerations for post and medical forensic exam for survivors and abusers, but we want to highlight some key areas. So when Frank is transported back to the facility, he is asked if he wants to be placed in protective custody or back in general population in his housing unit. Frank expresses he does not want to be placed in protective custody. So now when Frank made that report of sexual abuse to the officer, another activity that should have simultaneously occurred is the monitoring for retaliation. Now let's move on to ongoing services and considerations for the post-medical forensic exam for the abuser. The abuser should be offered therapy, counseling, or other interventions. And the purpose behind this is to address and correct underlying reasons or motivations for the abuse. And the facility should consider whether to require the offender to participate in such interventions as a condition of access to programming or even other benefits. Marianne, I'm going to hand it back over to you.
Copy that. Thanks, Monica. So what you see here in the next portion is the distinction between the criminal and the administrative investigations. And as I said earlier, those can run parallel, those can run one starting and then the administrative picking up. If there's any hint of any criminal conduct, the criminal investigation should go first. And then through collaboration and discussion, the decision made as to when to initiate the administrative investigation. This is repeating what's been said earlier. So, and also the components about providing support and ongoing therapy and support for the victim survivor, and then also the standards require that services be provided to the perpetrator. So I'm going to move on because again, all of these components have been referenced in one way or another through previous slides. Monica?
And we're going to wrap it up with just mentioning that the facility ended up doing a sexual assault incident review. And the facility conducted this because the sexual abuse investigation was substantiated for Frank. So please note that the review should take place within 30 days of the conclusion of every sexual abuse investigation where the allegation has a finding of substantiated or unsubstantiated. And the only time a sexual abuse incident review would not be conducted is if the investigation had determined the allegation to be unfounded. So the slide provides details about who needs to be included as part of that review team, as well as what must be included in the review. So I'm going to hand it back over to Angelita.
Thank you, Monica. Thank you, Marianne. You guys did a great job going through that case study. So we want to just take a few minutes. Well, we're not really going to take a few minutes, but we want to give you the opportunity to insert questions regarding the case study that Marianne and Monica just went through into the Q&A, so into your question and answer box. Again, the goal is for us to review those and create a handout that we will be providing answers to and sending out to everyone. I will remind you after each case study that box is there, and then you're more than welcome to add your questions as we're doing the case studies as well as you think of them. I'm going to hand it over now to Cynthia so that she can present the second case study that we have for you. But I do just want to point out that the very first one that we just went through with you was very in detail, and it showed you the process and the response of each person. The next two will be more of a going through the actual scenario and then pointing out specific considerations based on that case study. So there's a little bit of a switch up in the format.
Hey everyone. Okay, so we're going to go through a scenario right now around remote medical forensic exam accompaniment, meaning a situation where the rape crisis advocate is providing accompaniment, but they're not physically there at the hospital, or in a case where an exam is perhaps being done on site at the facility, they're not there in person. So presumably they're participating and providing accompaniment via phone. So if we can go to the next slide. So you are a rape crisis advocate. So this scenario is really specific to the perspective and considerations for the rape crisis advocate in particular. During a nighttime hotline shift at the Rape Crisis Center, the phone rings. When you pick it up, the caller says, "This is Sergeant Smith calling from the hospital for a PREA. I have the offender here with me. We are here waiting for the nurse." You notice that it sounds as if you are on speakerphone. Next slide. After explaining that there is another custody staff in the room, Sergeant Smith says, "Okay, you want to speak to the offender now?" Then you hear him say, "You can talk now. This is the advocate on the line." After a pause, you hear another voice ask Sergeant Smith, "What's an advocate?" Next slide. You hear a voice come on the line. "Hello, this is Jay." You provide your name and the name of your rape crisis program, and you say what pronouns you use. Jay responds, "Oh man, okay, I'm a little out of it. Who do you say you are again? What do you mean pronouns? It's so cold in here. They got me in a paper gown and cuffs. You work for DOC?" Next slide. You ask the sergeant if a blanket can be provided for Jay, and you ask if he can take you off speakerphone so you can talk with Jay privately. The sergeant orders the other officer to get Jay a blanket. He goes on to say that Jay's handcuffs have to stay on, so the call will need to continue to be via speakerphone. Next slide. You mentioned to Jay the key points from your agency's short script for remote forensic accompaniment, including that the nurse should have a copy of your agency's brochure to give him, which includes how he can dial your hotline from any phone at the facility. Then you tell Jay that what happened isn't his fault. You hear the other custody staff say in a low voice to the sergeant, "Excuse me, advocate, this guy is not exactly what you'd call a poor little victim. I could have seen this whole thing coming." Next slide. You hear the sergeant order the other custody staff to stand outside the doorway and wait there until the exam is over. Then you hear a familiar voice say, "Hello, I'm Ramona, the forensic nurse." You tell Jay, "Ramona will be able to answer your questions about the exam step by step. If there is any part of the exam that you don't want to do, you can say no." You offer to stay on the call with Jay for as long as he would like. "That's all right," Jay says. "Maybe I can talk to you again after the exam is over." Before the call ends, the sergeant tells you, "We will call back following the exam," just like it says in the protocol. A few hours later, the phone rings again. Sergeant Smith is on the other end and informs you that the exam is concluded. You ask him if it's possible to speak with Jay off of speakerphone. He agrees and helps Jay position the phone between his chin and his shoulder. Next slide. "Hello," says Jay. You reintroduce yourself and your agency before asking him if he's all right. "No, I'm not," Jay replies. You reassure him that what happened to him is not his fault, and you ask if you can send a packet of materials to him. Jay agrees, and you write his full name and inmate number in the appropriate space on your agency's intake form, and let him know he should receive something from your agency shortly. Remember, you can always reach out to us via the hotline as well. So that's the end of the scenario. And so I just wanted to go over some considerations, and I won't have time probably to go over all of the kind of things that came up in the scenario, but I think a good starting point is to remember that you want to go into this as the rape crisis advocate following the protocols that are set by your agency and state. And that's a message really for everyone who's participating in this webinar today, that the rape crisis advocate's responsibilities don't change just because this is a person who happens to be incarcerated, right? That this is a survivor who happens to be incarcerated. They still have the same obligations around confidentiality. They still have all of the same concerns, and their role is the same. As Marian touched on earlier, the role is quite critical, and they are there as the person who is there for that survivor. Everybody else in the room has a very particular, different role and sort of interest that they must speak to and answer to, but the advocate is there for the survivor. So, and I just wanted to, step back a little bit, right, and to think about the fact that this question around remote accompaniment, certainly it comes up and can come up a lot right now in the midst of the pandemic, but it also can come up in cases, for example, especially of rural programs that might not be able to be on site and get to that hospital or that facility in a timely way. So it's also a consideration that way. And it is something that's been happening in the community as well in the midst of COVID. So, and again, when it comes to the protocols that are in place, the other thing that I want to say about protocol is that so much of what happened in this scenario are things that should have been anticipated and addressed in advance. So by going through, and I'll get to this a little bit more in a minute, by sort of talking step by step and being at the table with the partners to be able to talk about, okay, how will we handle these various questions? How will we handle questions around security? How will we handle questions around the level of restraint that will be used, around the presence of various people in the room, right? Those are all things that you want to be thinking about and have your leadership, whoever it is the appropriate person, for example, within your rape crisis program, who would be handling the negotiation, for example, of your memorandum of understanding and setting out what those protocols are. These are things that should be brought to that person's attention. So, for example, if you are the rape crisis advocate who is essentially responsible for working with incarcerated survivors, but you're fairly new, let's say, or you're not necessarily empowered to negotiate an MOU with an outside corrections agency, then those are things that you want to educate your leadership about, that, hey, these are what we should be thinking about when we go to the table with the various partners, the corrections agency, the hospital, the SANE, SAFE, et cetera. So the other thing to keep in mind here in the next bullet is to advocate for a level of care that's consistent with what you would see in the community. So things like, for example, the fact that Jay was saying, I'm in a thin paper gown, I'm freezing cold, I have handcuffs on. And I know that obviously, the handcuff issue is because he's incarcerated. I'll talk more about that in a minute. But like with the blanket, the advocate did the right thing by asking for the officer to bring Jay a blanket, right? Those are some of the reasons why the advocate is there, to provide and try to ensure that there is a victim-centered, trauma-informed approach, that just because this person is incarcerated doesn't mean that there's a different set of norms that apply. So try to have your care be as consistent and your advocacy be as consistent for people who are incarcerated as what you would do for people who are in the community that you're advocating for. And then one of the important things too, I mentioned about the MOU already, and then the last bullet here is around communicating any changes in procedure, any changes, for example, in an MOU, for example, if there's an MOU between you and the facility that your program and the facility that the SANE or SAFE should know about, you want to keep the SANE, SAFE in the conversation, right? Make sure that they are aware of things that they should know about if there's something that has changed in terms of a procedure or something like that. And you also want to be able to think about ways in which that SANE or SAFE might be involved in some of the steps that need to be taken to provide a trauma-informed approach for that survivor. So for example, you might ask if the forensic nurse can have a release of information on hand that survivor can complete so that the advocate then can contact the survivor after the exam and provide that follow-up. You might want to make sure that the SANE SAFE has a brochure, has information about your program so that the survivor will have that information in hand to take. And that might include not only just information about how to get in touch with your program, but basic information about the fact of beginning to heal in the aftermath of a sexual assault. So I wanted to just pause and see if Angelita or Monica, did you want to comment any further around what I was saying about the SANE SAFE and that relationship?
Basically, I think that what you said covered most of it. For the most part, it's really important to actually interact with each other and have communication beforehand, during the actual exam, and even most of the time afterwards, just to make sure that all the care, all the advocacy, all the services are being consistent, and that it's in a plan. And so it's kind of a fluid motion. We do understand, that we also have to look at each circumstance on a case-by-case basis, and that sometimes you may have to alter. But if you have that relationship there, if you have that open communication there, being able to shift and alter makes this so much better. All you have to do is say, hey, this is what's going on here. How can we work this from our end to work with you from your end to make this experience as best as possible?
And I'd like to just point out that the interaction between the survivor and that transport officer or any facility staff at the various stages of sexual abuse response can have a profound effect on the survivor and their trauma. And in this case, as you mentioned with handcuffs, could be a trigger for that person even before the sexual abuse had occurred. They could have a history of trauma. Same with even PAT searches, right? At least informing, I know security operations and procedures might say that you have to have the person handcuffed. If that's the case, explain that to the survivor. Give them the why so that they understand why this is happening and in this way. So at least they can prepare themselves physically and emotionally for that.
And I would say have that conversation with the healthcare provider as well, because the healthcare provider is going to be trying to give the most patient-centered care. And, one of the requests may be, is it possible that we can have one handcuffed instead of two handcuffed? Or, we're going to be assessing the safety and trying to figure out how we can make this as patient-friendly. And also, being able to explain to the patient, we have to keep you in handcuffs, and so maybe we'll have to shift handcuffs. Maybe at this point, it helps us to be able to prepare the patient for what's going to happen during the exam process.
Great, thanks so much, guys. The next slide, please. So I just wanted to quickly contrast what in-person accompaniment might look like versus remote accompaniment, just some of the big differences. And it can certainly be harder for that rape crisis advocate because they may be accustomed to a scenario in person where, a forensic medical exam that whole process can take 4 to 5 hours, maybe more in some cases. So the advocate might be used to scenarios where they are there in person on hand for that entire time. And there are lots of ways in which they can show up to support that survivor. And help to empower that survivor and speak to that survivor's urgent emotional needs. Now, remote accompaniment, on the other hand, because you're on the phone and because of just kind of the practicalities of that, right? You're talking to the survivor probably on a hospital phone. That may be more like a 15 to 30 minute sort of involvement that you have. You certainly want to advocate, and again, do so beforehand, for being able to talk with that survivor before the exam and again after, but it's still going to be a limited amount of time. And you're not going to be in person. You're going to be limited to your words, the tone of your voice, and you're going to just have less opportunity to provide that emotional support. And that's why it's so important to sort of figure out in advance things like the release of information, any brochure or other materials that you might want to ask the sane or safe to have on hand to give to that person. Next slide, please. Another thing that you're going to want to think about, really, it's quite obvious, right, is shortening your script. Shortening, kind of thinking about what are the main sorts of things that you would want to be able to say and relate to that survivor if you were in person, and how can you do that in a much shorter period of time? You saw that the advocate in this scenario really just emphasized this isn't your fault, right? This isn't your fault. And then really took the time to try to see what they could do even over the phone to promote a trauma-informed environment. Can we get this person a blanket? Can we get off of speakerphone so that I can have a confidential conversation with this person? What am I going to do in my conversation if there are other people on the phone If it's not a private conversation, or if I am on speakerphone, how do I need to curtail what I'm saying to protect that person's confidentiality? I don't want to prompt them to get into information, for example, that might not be things that we would want shared, given that there are officials, corrections officials, et cetera, listening in, and that you're not having an opportunity to speak privately with that person. So in general, you might be used to a scenario where you're thinking about a survivor who's in a private room, with a door. But just like someone in the community, they may not be alone in that room. There may be others present, and you have to think about how to negotiate that. So now you have to think about how to negotiate that, virtually, and what the sane or safe can do, and what you can work out in that relationship beforehand, both with the corrections officials and with the medical staff and the sane safe, to sort of maximize confidentiality and safety. Next slide, please. So other considerations. Let's see. So you want to definitely make sure that the person is going to have access to information about how to, access your services. Maybe this is someone who's never called the hotline before, like maybe there are hotline services that you or your state coalition or some other entity provides for that facility. You want to make sure you reiterate that, hey, these are things that you can take advantage of. Here's a way to get confidential support, hopefully via letter, via phone. Here's a way that you might be able to follow up with me individually and have a confidential conversation, or what mental health services and resources are available at the facility. Think about all of that in advance. What is it that you need to relate to this person? And certainly things like speaking slowly, repeating yourself, thinking about questions around accessibility. This is a person who's in the midst of some of the most severe trauma a person can ever go through in their entire lives. So, just like Jay was saying, like, are you from the DOC? What's an advocate? I mean, you could see in so many ways that trauma was reflected. Now, there are ways to address some of that. The fact that Jay didn't seem to know what an advocate was, as Marian and Monica explained, that is information that should have been shared with Jay when he was still at the hospital. Right? So you have this option to have a medical forensic exam. A victim advocate can be provided to be there with you and to support you in that process. So hopefully if that information is provided, Jay goes into it with more understanding. But certainly you want Jay or that survivor to know that, no, you do not work for the DOC. You are someone that they can talk with confidentially, whether it's in that moment or in a later moment, but that your role is to be there for them. Your role is not to represent the DOC in any way. And again, in the last bullet here, identify one or two takeaways for the survivor ahead of time. You have, in a remote accompaniment scenario, again, you have very little time. What do you want to be able to get across, especially given that you don't have any guarantee of how long that conversation is going to go on? You're not in the room. The corrections officials ultimately are going to have a lot of the control about what happens. And so you want to be efficient with your words and kind of, make sure that the main things are said. And I just want to take, a couple more minutes and then I'll let Angelita get in. Again, there are some things that came up in the scenario. Person first language, right? And this is a message for, corrections officials as well. Think about the language that you're using, the way that you're talking about this person who is a survivor of sexual abuse, right? Things like saying, oh, the offender is here now, as opposed to saying, Jay is here, or the survivor is here, or the person who I've brought from the facility is here. Think about, how you are communicating in that moment. And how that sort of translates for that person. Mentioning your pronouns, it's important to do that, especially given that the survivor might be someone who's transgender, even if they're not, right? It just shows that, again, you are someone who is providing a safe environment, an open environment, and you're saying, this is why I'm here. I'm here for you. I'm telling you who I am. You can tell me who you are, essentially. So I'm going to wrap up there. There's more that I would say if I had more time. One last thing I will say, and this is something that someone raised in the chat that I thought was great, is around the self-care question, and Marian talked about it as well. You can talk to the facility about making sure that the survivor can have an opportunity to take a shower when they get back to the facility, for example. And a shower is not something that's guaranteed in a correction setting. It often, might only happen a few times a week. So things like that, to kind of know to ask for that and to make sure that's going to happen. And then, yeah, they're not going to be able to light a candle, but can you give some information to the nurse that could then be given to the survivor around breathing exercises, drawing, journaling, taking paper and tearing it up when they feel angry? Like, are there simple self-care things, a self-care wheel that's adapted for the corrections environment that you can give them? Okay, thank you. Angelita, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. Nice job. Okay, so we had a poll question, but we're going to forego the poll question just so that we'll be able to get through the last case study in our last few minutes here. But you can definitely take this and kind of take it back with you as a takeaway. Think about what this looks like in your community and what you're able to provide as far as remote advocacy for patients or for survivors. And then I also want to just remind you that the Q&A box is there. So if you had any questions specific to the scenario that Cynthia just shared with us, please feel free to add questions to the Q&A. And I'm going to move forward and I'm going to talk about the third and final case study. It's going to discuss experiences of an inmate or an incarcerated person, and her name is Sam. So Sam is an adult transgender woman that has not obtained gender reassignment surgery, but has been going through breast augmentation with hormone therapy. Sam uses she and her pronouns. Sam is in custody in a state prison, and she has been in her housing unit for 2 weeks. Since being in the unit, Sam's cellmate Jason has touched her butt several times in passing and groped her breast over her clothing once. After the groping, Sam reported the incident to a corrections officer and requested to be moved, but her request was denied. 2 days after the report, Sam was cornered by Jason while coming out of the shower. Jason fondled Sam's breast and twisted her nipples. At the sound of the group of men coming into the showers, Jason walked away, leaving Sam standing against the wall. Later that night, once back in their cell, when the lights were turned off, Jason forced Sam out of bed with a sharp object held to her neck and orally assaulted Sam. Jason's ejaculation went into Sam's mouth and onto her face. Once Jason returned to his bunk, Sam wiped her face with her shirt, removed the shirt, hid it under her mattress, and returned to her bunk. The following morning, Sam reported the events that occurred to a counselor and again requested to be moved to a different cell. The counselor noticed that the right side of Sam's neck was red and asked Sam if she was having any pain, which Sam responded that the side of her neck was painful. After speaking to Sam, the counselor notified the medical staff of the need to have a medical forensic examination arranged for Sam, which initiated the coordinated sexual abuse response protocol. So I'm just going to take a few minutes and go through some of the considerations of this particular case study. So Sam was identified as a transgender woman. So just to be clear so that everyone understands, this means that she was assigned a male sex at birth, but identifies her gender as female. At this point, Sam has not had any gender reassignment surgeries. So what that means is that she has male sex organs. We also have to keep in mind that she is taking hormones to assist in breast development. I thought it would be clear to paint that picture for you so you have a better understanding in case those words didn't really process for you. Some of it was really heavy medical. So some of the things that we noticed here was definitely there were safety issues and safety concerns. There was no corrections response activated the first time that Sam made a report regarding being touched on the butt and having her breast groped over her clothing. The other concern to think about is that both Sam and Jason are housed in the same cell. And that's also note that there's been an escalation in the level of violence and the type of violence against Sam. Since this time, there was a weapon present, and it also included Sam being orally assaulted. There was skin-to-skin contact in the shower. So as you recall, he fondled her breast and twisted her nipples. So she was naked at that point. So there was skin-to-skin contact. There has been no oral hygiene since the event actually occurred where she was orally assaulted. So there's the potential there for touch DNA as well as biological DNA. And that's because of, again, there was an oral assault plus there was ejaculation from the abuser to the survivor. And then some other considerations include they're not having, since there are no other inmates that entered the shower causing Jason to stop and leave, there were those other inmates that actually entered the shower. So if you recall an earlier scenario, Monica and Marion were discussing things that we think about regarding investigation and interviewing of possible witnesses. This would be one of those times, thinking about those particular inmates being there, and is there any video that you can look at to say, oh yes, there was definitely people walking in and then maybe the abuser was actually walking out. Think about the fact that the second event occurred in the cell that both Sam and Jason both share. So Sam resides there, Jason resides there. Sam has left the cell. She is reported. Now we have a concern because Jason still has access there. There's also evidence hidden there. She's tucked away her shirt there. So we may want to think about the fact of how can we secure that scene? How can we make sure that the evidence gets properly taken in by the detectives at this point? And Monica or Marion, if you want to chime anything in that point, please feel free. Otherwise, I'm just going to keep going so that we can get the last one in.
Nothing from me, Angelita.
I would just like to point out that each of these incidents should have been referred for a criminal investigation.
So just thinking of the overall case altogether, Sam definitely needs medical intervention. So she has a complaint of pain, she has visible injury, and then she had a sexual assault occur. That was an oral assault with ejaculation. So we have sexually transmitted infection concerns for that survivor. There needs to be a full assessment and documentation of the patient and any findings as far as any evidence that is being collected, any injuries, anything additional that is observed within that exam. And then we need to, of course, have informed consent of that patient, as we talked about earlier, and making sure that the patient fully understands or the survivor fully understands everything that is being offered, including medications, and that they are aware that they can decline any of those things as well. The survivors made multiple attempts to speak up on their own behalf, and it was not acknowledged. So there is a clear need for victim advocacy for this survivor, because regardless of the fact that they're incarcerated, what's happening makes a difference and it needs to be addressed. We also have to think about the investigation piece. You just heard Monica chime in that there were several different incidents that occurred, and each incident is a crime that needs to be investigated. And then we also have to think about the fact that that Jason actually is there. You know, they have him and they can do a suspect exam on him. They can request evidence from him, or they can obtain a warrant to get evidence on him. So, you know, all of those things are taken into consideration. And that was something that was pointed out in the very first scenario by Marion.
I do want to add real quickly, as Monica said, the previous over the clothes grabbing of breast, that is a crime. And that should have been not only reported, but then having a law enforcement response. And then the other thing is that the oral assault is penetrative. Oftentimes people just think of penis into vagina or penis into rectum anus as assaultive or penetrative, but putting a penis or other object into someone's mouth is a penetrative assault. So that is definitely criminal and a learning component for those who are not investigators.
Thanks, Marian. So we know that it is right now 3:31, and we definitely appreciate all of you that have stayed on. I am going to close out with the last 2 slides on public health, and if you have to leave, we totally understand, but because it's being recorded, I do want to go over those slides. I also want to point out that the QA box is there. That was our 3rd scenario, so please feel free to add any questions that you may have regarding that scenario into that box, so that we can create that handout and address any questions that you had, especially since we haven't been able to address any questions throughout this presentation. So with that being said, I'm just going to kind of wrap up with our last 2 slides. I just wanted to point out, I'm not sure if you guys are aware or not, but President Biden officially designated this week, April 5th through April 11th, as a National Public Health Week. And this kind of hits right on what we're going to talk about in the next 2 slides around public safety and public health for the community and for incarcerated persons as they re-enter in the community. So Marian, if you want to take the first one really quickly, and I'll take the last slide.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Angelita. So public health is at the foundation of the development of the Prison Rape Elimination Act. Along with that, of course, are the issues of equity, human dignity, and fairness that are essential considerations in ensuring that you have a sexually safe facility that you're operating. The other piece is that, as those of you who are correction professionals know and understand, is that 95+% of those folks incarcerated are going to be returned back to the community. And so we want to ensure that they're not returning much more and sexually traumatized, much more traumatized and sexually traumatized, which will impact their reentry, right? And then the other component, as Angelita said, is there is a huge public health component to this, to sexual abuse that happens in a confinement setting, from the emotional aspect and also from health, the physical health components, transmission of sexually transmitted disease and infection, the additional trauma that's caused to a survivor who's incarcerated in sexual abuse. So public health and safety is a key component to ensuring that we prevent, detect, and respond to sexual abuse and sexual harassment activities in a confinement setting. And I'm going to leave it at that and move on to Angelita.
Thanks, Marian. And so this last slide is some information that was gathered from the American Academy of Family Physicians Foundation. They released a position paper in March of this year, and they highlighted some of the following information regarding public safety and health on both the incarcerated person and the general community. So some of the things that it highlighted was the fact that incarcerated individuals have a higher rate of infectious disease, mental health disorders, and substance abuse and addiction. So what that points out for us is that their health is also affected negatively by their environment. That includes factors such as any trauma and any violence that they may have experienced, like what we talked about in today's webinar. It can also include any overcrowding within the facilities as well. The position paper informed us that only 11% of individuals who have a substance use disorder receive drug treatment while incarcerated. So for this reason, individuals who have chronic addictions have a higher risk of either going through withdrawal while they're in custody, or they're also at a higher risk for overdosing when they return into the community. In addition, there are concerns for families. So that includes parents that are removed from families and their homes. This leaves a one parent in charge to manage a household. There's decreased or limited income, if any at all. It could also mean that there's no parents in the home to care for children. So either the child will be sent into foster care, or they may have to go reside with another family member, which also affects what's happening in that household or the household of the family member that they're going through. They're concerned about incarcerated individuals who are pregnant. So babies are being born to incarcerated parents, right? So that's not good at all. And what about in situations where the mom is the only parent that the child has? So now that child is either, again, put into foster care or given to another family member to care for. The other thing we have to think about is that for a child, having an incarcerated parent may have a negative health and social consequence for them in long term. Another thing we want to think about is transitioning from reentry to the community can be super stressful and under-resourced for incarcerated individuals. So they're released from prison, they must find housing, they must find employment, they must find access to healthcare. And in addition to all that, they're trying to reintegrate themselves back into their families and the community. That's super stressful. And add on top of that, the other factors that we just thought about, what if they have health issues that that developed either in prison or got recognized in prison that they have to come out and try and address. So there are often barriers to accessing providers as well as management of health conditions and substance abuse treatment once they are released into community. And this also is the same thing for mental health issues. They may be receiving care in the facility when they're incarcerated, but that care may not be maintained once they enter in the community. So really, I just want to point out that this is something that everyone really needs to think about, because as you see here between this slide and the slide that Marian just went over, this doesn't just affect one individual that's been incarcerated, and it affects families, and it affects the individual, and it also affects the community. So we really need to think about that. We provided some resources for you guys that are inside of your handout. I just lost my thought process, sorry. But there are some resources that you can take that link and go to. Those are provided for you. And then contact information for all 4 of us is provided inside of your handout as well. Every person on this call has their organization actually does technical assistance. So again, IAFN, we host the Safe TA resource and take TA project around sexual assault forensic exams. Just Detention also has a TA request available, as well as PREA Resource Center. So we're wrapping it up with that, and I want to say thank you to all of you for hanging in there with us for this additional 8 minutes. We very much appreciate you being here. We will create that handout for you and make sure that it gets out to all the people that were registered for this. You will get an evaluation. You will get a link for an evaluation put into the chat, and you will also get one emailed to you. And I also just really, truly want to thank Cynthia, Maria, and Monica for being here and helping me present all this information. Thank you so much.